The Magician's Tea Party, Part 3. "Well, what can I do for you?" asked the magician, before they had time to say anything, for truly he would not have been a magician at all if he had not known what they were thinking. He smiled so encouragingly that the little king answered him at once. "It's like this," he began. "There's something wrong with the way I see." "Of course there is," said the magician. "The gremlins threw dust in your eyes when you were a baby. You cannot expect to see things in the same light as other people when the gremlins have thrown dust in your eyes." "Why did they throw dust in my eyes?" asked little King Wistful. "Usual reason," answered the magician briefly. "They were not asked to your christening, that's all. If people persist in leaving the gremlins out when they give a party, they must take the consequences. However, as you were not to blame in the matter, the gremlins would be the first to own up that you should not be bewitched any longer. The best thing you can do is to go to Gremlin Land yourself and ask them to take away the spell." Little King looked at Eyebright and hesitated. "Is it a long way to go all alone?" he asked. Eyebright immediately stepped up close to him and took his hand. "I'll come with you," she said. "I've always longed to go to the other side of the sun. How are we to get there, magician?" "Well," answered the magician, "the usual way is to climb up a sunbeam, but that's not very quick, and sunbeams are apt to be slippery in the dry weather. Shall I send you up in a flash of lightning, or on the spur of a lark?" "Spur of a lark?" echoed the king. "You mean on the spur of a moment, don't you?" "No, not a bit," answered the magician. "You'd never get up to the Gremlin Land on the spur of anything but a lark, I can tell you. You have to get there very early, in any case, if you want to be up with the gremlins. So the best way is to rise with the lark. However, as it's getting rather late in the day for larks, I'd better send you in a lightning flash. Will you manage it alone, or shall I send a conductor with you?" "Would the conductor show us the way?" asked Eyebright. "Dear me, no," said the magician. "Lightning conductors never show anything but the stupidity of some people. Perhaps you'd better have the lightning without the conductor. So stand on one side. I'll pick you out a nice quiet flash without any thunder hanging to it." He took down a large sack labelled "Storms" from the shelf, and untied the top and plunged his head into it. Eyebright moved closer to the king and hoped that nothing would go off with a bang. "I say," said His Majesty, putting his arm around her, "it strikes me—" "That is impossible," interrupted the magician in a stuffy voice from the middle of the sack, "for I've got both hands in, and it isn't going to strike anybody so long as you treat it kindly. Now, off you go in a flash." And off they did go in something, though they never knew what it was, for they had no time to see anything before they found themselves dropped with a thud on the other side of the sun. For a moment or two they just lay there where they had fallen without moving. Then they sat up, rubbed their eyes, and looked around. "Oh!" exclaimed Eyebright, clasping her hands tightly. "I had no idea what it was like." Of course Eyebright knew no more about Gremlin Land than she had learned in her geography lessons, and we all know how little geography books ever tell us about the really nice places in the world. So although she knew as well as any other little girl that Gremlin Land has no physical features, and its inhabitants have no occupation, that its climate is dull and foggy, and its government is a sleeping monarchy, she was not in the least prepared for what she did see. "Well," said a voice somewhere near, "what do you think of it?" Just in front of them was a gremlin standing on his head, which is a gremlin's favourite way of resting his legs. He seemed to expect an answer, so the king did his best to think of one that should be both polite and truthful. As a matter of fact, He did not think much of Gremlin Land at all. "It is rather full of fog, isn't it?" he began a little nervously. The Gremlin looked distinctly hurt, but before he had time to get angry, Eyebright put things right in her quiet little way. "I don't think it's yellow fog," she said. "It's more like dull sunshine." The Gremlin was slightly more happy when he heard this. "You've hit it," he cried in a delighted tone. "That's what it is, really. It's the folks from the front of the sun who call it yellow fog. They're blinded by their own sunshine, they are. This is the back of the sun, you see, and sunshine naturally loses a bit of its polish by the time it's worked through." "I think I like bright sunshine best," observed the king. "That is absurd," said the Gremlin. "Why, you can't look at it without blinking to begin with. In Gremlin Land you get all the advantages of the sun and none of the drawbacks. No sunblinds, no sunstrokes, no sunspots. You must be a stupid boy if you can't see that." "It's your fault, not mine," answered the king boldly. "You shouldn't have thrown dust in my eyes if you wanted me to see Gremlin Land in the right light." The Gremlin turned several somersaults to show his amazement at the king's words, and finally stood thoughtfully on one leg. "That's serious," he said. "We didn't know you'd ever come up here, or we shouldn't have done it. However, it can't be helped now, so you'd better go back again. It doesn't matter if you do not see things wrong at the front of the sun." "But it does matter," they both exclaimed. "That's why we want you to take away the spell, please," said King Wistful and Eyebright. Gremlin stood on his head again and shook from side to side, which no one but a Gremlin could have done, considering the awkwardness of the position. "There's only one thing to be done," he said at last. "You must exchange eyes." They stared at the Gremlin and then at each other. The little king began to think busily, but Eyebright spoke without thinking at all. "Very well," she said. "How is it to be done?" "Quite easy," answered the Gremlin cheerfully. "All you've got to do is wish with all your might to have the king's eyes instead of your own, and there you are." At that moment the king finished his thinking. "Stop!" he shouted. "If I take her eyes away, she will always see things wrong." But the king had spoken too late. Eyebright had already wished with all her might that her eyes turned as blue as deep water, while his Majesty's were round and large and brown. "What fun!" she cried, laughing happily. "Isn't it nice change to have someone else's eyes?" The little king, however, was far too furious to listen to her. "Stand up and let me knock you down," he cried, shaking his fist at the Gremlin. "Look what you've done. She will see things wrong to the end of her days." "Don't be a foolish little boy," said the Gremlin calmly. "Take her home and try to see things right yourself." The king certainly did not take her home, nor himself either. But that is the truth that they both found themselves, the very next minute, standing on the top of the small green hill and looking down at the kingdom of the monotonous isles. "Hooray!" shouted King Wistful, waving his crown joyfully in the air. "What a beautiful kingdom I've got! Look how the sun glints on the cornfields, and see the great red and blue patches of flowers. Don't you think it's a beautiful kingdom?" he added, turning to the little girl in the sunbonnet. Eyebright was distinctly puzzled. She thought she only saw 5 round islands in a row. But of course it was impossible. The king couldn't be mistaken. So she looked once more over the kingdom of the monotonous isles, and then back at the anxious face of the little king. "Yes," she said softly, "it is as you say, a beautiful kingdom." She ran down the hill and disappeared amongst the slender trees of the baby wood, and little King Wistful went home to bed. There is now a queen as well as a king of the monotonous Isles. She has black hair and blue eyes, and she wears a crown instead of a sunbonnet. And she quite agrees with the king whenever he tells her how beautiful their kingdom is. And if this should seem remarkable to some people, it need only be remembered that the queen sees everything with the king's eyes.
And now it is time for all little children to go to sleep. Good night.